The marble walls of Caligula's palace did not echo with debate. They trembled under the sound of pleas. Under his rule, Rome's noble class learned a new definition of fear, a fear so refined, so ritualized, that fathers were forced to auction the purity of their own daughters, and husbands were commanded to applaud the violation of their wives as if it were theatre. This was not madness born of impulse. It was structure, a system, engineered with precision, where cruelty had an administrative form. Horror became part of the empire's economy, documented like any imperial expense, with ledgers, seals, and official witnesses. That was how the greatest civilization of the ancient world bowed before an institution of orchestrated depravity. But to understand how Rome descended into such darkness, we must return to the day a smiling young man was crowned as the savior of the empire. Before we dive into this shadowed tale, remember to support this humble channel. Leave your like, subscribe, and help us bring more of history's forgotten nightmares to life. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, affectionately called Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from his childhood among the legions. Son of the beloved General Germanicus, his rise was celebrated with festivals that lasted 100 days. The people saw in him the heir to Rome's glorious past. Senators, exhausted by the paranoia of Tiberius, sighed in relief. None could imagine that this charming, eloquent young man would become the architect of the most methodical corruption Rome had ever known. Caligula's childhood was a paradox of privilege and trauma. He grew up among military camps, adored by the soldiers who worshipped his father. Yet he also witnessed the slow poisoning of that same father, the exile of his mother Agrippina the Elder, and the execution or imprisonment of his brothers. Surrounded by betrayal, the boy learned early that survival in Rome depended on disguise. Under Emperor Tiberius, he perfected the art of pretending to be harmless, even foolish. Behind his smiles, however, he studied everything: fear, ambition, weakness. When he finally rose to power, his first months were almost miraculous. He reduced taxes, released political prisoners, funded games and grand spectacles, repaired aqueducts, and rewarded the legions. Rome adored him. Women threw flowers in his path, children sang his name in the streets, and senators competed for his favor. It was the golden dawn Rome had longed for after the shadows of Tiberius. Where his predecessor had hidden on the island of Capri, Caligula walked freely among the crowds. He greeted gladiators, shared banquets with senators, and smiled for the people. For a moment it seemed that the gods had finally gifted Rome with the perfect ruler. But something within him broke. In the autumn of the year 37, he fell ill, a mysterious sickness that chained him to his bed for weeks. Courtiers spoke of impossible fevers, violent convulsions, and delirious nights in which he shouted that Jupiter himself had spoken to him. Across Rome, citizens prayed and sacrificed animals in every temple. Some even vowed their own lives for the emperor's recovery. And then he woke. But the man who opened his eyes was not the same. The first signs of change were subtle. He ordered that all statues of the gods bear his face. Soon his transformation became undeniable. Witnesses said his once warm eyes turned cold and glassy, his pupils fixed and wide, as if he stared into some invisible abyss. He no longer slept. Servants would find him wandering the palace gardens at night, speaking to the moon, to statues, to phantoms that no one else could see. Sometimes he was found at dawn, naked and covered in dirt, claiming he had been planting the future of Rome. But what he planted were not seeds. They were the roots of a new terror. It began with his own sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. They were not merely family. They became the first instruments of his new doctrine of control. His obsession with Drusilla was particularly disturbing. He called her his Diana, the goddess of purity, and forced her to sit beside him at imperial banquets, as if she were his wife. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, Caligula's grief turned Rome to stone. He banned laughter, bathing, and family gatherings during the mourning period. Anyone caught smiling was executed, but his mourning was not love. It was ownership denied. After her death, his desires spread to her sisters, and later to the wives and daughters of senators. From the shadows of his golden throne, he forced noble women to submit while their fathers and husbands watched in silence. What seemed like cruelty was, in truth, a mechanism of power. Caligula took notes, literal records, on who resisted, who hesitated, who pretended to enjoy. These notes would later become tools of blackmail. A senator who had shown too much enthusiasm for Julia Livilla would soon find himself voting in favor of every imperial decree. Another, who dared to show reluctance, would discover his youngest son missing, only to find him days later, mutilated and unrecognizable. In Caligula's Rome, no one was innocent. Everyone was either a victim or an accomplice. Centuries later, fragments of this nightmare would be found in the writings of Lucius Scriba, the imperial physician whose secret journals were discovered in a ruined villa near Pompeii. In his hidden manuscripts, the imperial physician Lucius Scriba wrote with chilling precision about the horrors he was forced to witness. He described how Emperor Caligula commanded him to inspect the wives and daughters of Rome's most powerful families, not for healing, but for evaluation. Their fertility, their physical endurance, even their reactions to pain were meticulously recorded. The examinations were humiliating, performed in the emperor's presence. Caligula would stand close, his gaze sharp and intrusive, asking obscene questions about every detail of a woman's body as if conducting a grotesque ritual. This was not chaotic cruelty. It was bureaucracy. Each victim received a number, each act was logged, each humiliation had a tariff, a protocol, and an imperial seal. 16 tercios for a night with a senator's wife, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 for both, a family discount in the empire of perversion. The payments were recorded as voluntary donations for the welfare of the state. The money flowed directly into the imperial treasury, a ledger of depravity disguised as patriotism. Caligula called his palace the Temple of Divine Service. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal reconstruction of architecture and meaning. Entire wings of the palace were redesigned. The Hall of Jupiter was reserved for ritualized violations, where Caligula would proclaim himself the living god, blessing his subjects with his divine seed. The Chamber of Venus became the stage for forced orgies, where Roman matrons were made to reenact mythological scenes while trembling beneath the eyes of their emperor. And then there was the Room of Priapus, a chamber of punishment decorated with obscene frescoes painted by the finest artists of Rome. The marble walls that had once echoed debates about the destiny of the known world now resounded with the muffled cries of the humiliated. Senators walked those corridors in silence, hearing everything, saying nothing. It was not madness anymore. It was an institution, a hierarchy of horror. At the lowest level were the wives of senators, compelled to serve in what Caligula called the imperial cult. They had schedules, uniforms, transparent Syrian silk togas, and strict rituals to follow. Then came their daughters, from the age of 12, initiated through what the emperor described as divine education. But Caligula's ambitions reached deeper still. He designed what secret archives referred to as the selective breeding program. The most fertile women were chosen to conceive children who would never know their fathers. Infants raised to be perfect imperial servants, trained from birth to obey only the emperor's will. Scriba's journals detail every pregnancy, every birth, every infant death. And there were many. Desperate mothers often resorted to self-inflicted abortions rather than bring another child into that nightmare. Even the men of Rome were not spared. Caligula devised new ways to desecrate their lineage. Young sons of noble families were dressed in translucent saffron robes, painted with white lead and vermilion, and forced to move, speak, and gesture as women. They were paraded during imperial banquets, offered to the highest bidder for a night's amusement. Caligula himself took part, not out of desire but to make a point. There is nothing sacred I cannot profane, no tradition I cannot corrupt, no family I cannot destroy. But perhaps the most insidious cruelty of all was not physical, it was moral. Caligula turned his victims into accomplices. Fathers did not merely know what was happening, they participated. They held the torches. They signed the contracts of voluntary service for their wives and daughters. They voted for the decrees that legalized their own degradation, including the infamous Lex Divina Corporis, which declared the emperor's body holy and any union with him a sacred act of worship. Caligula had discovered a weapon more devastating than tyranny: forced complicity. He did not simply destroy families, he made them destroy themselves. When Senator Cornelius Publicus refused to surrender his wife Livia to the divine service, he defied Caligula publicly in the Senate. It was a gesture of bravery and a death sentence. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found on the Senate steps, alive, mutilated, with a message carved into his skin: "Disobedience breeds extinction." That same afternoon, Cornelius brought his wife to the palace gates. 3 months later, when Livia conceived the emperor's child, Cornelius was forced to publicly recognize the infant as his legitimate heir, disinheriting his own bloodline. Humiliation became law. The Senate unanimously decreed that any child sired by the emperor, regardless of the mother's status, had priority in succession. Rome had legalized its own degradation. To maintain such an infernal machine, Caligula needed bureaucracy. A vast network of scribes kept records in a secret archive beneath the Palatine Hill. Each entry was categorized with chilling detail: the victim's name, age, social rank, physical description, acts performed, duration, level of resistance, pregnancies, payments, and even medical examinations before and after each encounter. Midwives, guards, accountants, hundreds of people, each played a role in the machinery of horror. And by dividing responsibility into fragments, Caligula ensured that no one saw themselves as the monster. They were just cogs, serving the empire, following orders. During full moons, the emperor hosted what he called lunar fertility ceremonies. The private amphitheater of the palace transformed into a pagan temple, marble soaked in wine and blood, perfumed with incense to disguise the stench of fear. What began as ritual soon became a spectacle, a festival of submission where Rome's most powerful bowed not to a god, but to a man who believed he was one. The emperor forced the wives of Rome's senators to engage in unspeakable acts with gladiators chosen for their virility, Nubian slaves brought from the distant edges of the empire, and at times even with animals, trained bears, mastiff dogs, and on one occasion a leopard presented as a gift by a submissive African king. The husbands, draped in their ceremonial togas, were compelled to watch from the balconies, maintaining the fragile facade of dignity while their wives were subjected to horrors that defied comprehension. Caligula presided over these atrocities as a divine master of ceremonies, orchestrating every encounter with meticulous precision. He decided who would be paired with whom, the number of encounters, the positions they would assume, and the timing of each act. In his hand, he wielded a ceremonial scepter, encrusted with golden phalluses pointing and directing as if the arena were a stage and he its god. Scribes recorded every detail: names, acts, durations, particularly remarkable performances, turning suffering into a perverse spectacle of imperial authority. An entire economy thrived around this system. Vendors peddled ointments promising relief from pain. Shadowy healers supplied abortive concoctions. Pimps instructed young women in the art of survival, and physicians specialized in repairing the physical damage. Everyone participated, everyone profited, and all were implicated in the machinery of horror. Rome itself became a silent accomplice. Merchants knew the origin of the gold flowing from senatorial households, a payment for their silence and compliance. Priests blessed unions they knew were forced. Poets composed odes in florid language, portraying real atrocities as if they were mythic feats. They say the body never lies, and within Caligula's palace, the bodies told stories no official chronicle would ever capture. Scars etched in patterns like a secret alphabet of pain, abdomens swollen with unwanted pregnancies, hidden beneath ever-widening garments, faces that had forgotten how to smile, muscles of joy atrophied from disuse. Among them was a young girl, Valeria, daughter of a minor senator, who after months of systematic abuse ceased to speak entirely. Her silence was not physical. Her vocal cords were intact, but there were no words in any tongue to describe the daily torment she endured. Her quietude became almost contagious, and the other victims avoided her gaze, as though in her eyes they glimpsed their own inevitable futures. Caligula developed obsessions that evolved over time, each more elaborate and grotesque than the last. He delighted in forcing mothers to witness the violation of their daughters, then inverted the roles, narrating the scenes as though reciting poetry. To him, destroying the bond between mother and child was equivalent to annihilating the very essence of Rome, the pietas, upon which the empire had been built. This was not mere cruelty, it was a twisted philosophy. If he could corrupt the most sacred bonds, the maternal love, the innocence of children, the honor of fathers, then he was truly divine. The gods, after all, violated mortals in myth. Zeus transformed into beasts to satiate his desires. Caligula merely modernized the tradition, taking it to its logical, horrific conclusion. There were whispered, desperate acts of resistance, almost always fatal. Some women attempted to poison themselves before reaching the palace, ingesting henbane or aconite stolen from the imperial gardens. Others disfigured their faces with knives or heated irons, hoping to render themselves useless to the system. Yet Caligula always had an answer. Suicides were revived by imperial physicians, masters of poisons and antidotes, and punished with repeated sessions, sometimes in public forums. The disfigured were employed in the same way, the emperor declaring that beauty was unnecessary for divine service, and that ugliness made the acts purer, untainted by aesthetic pleasure. Escape was impossible. Those who attempted to flee were hunted by the speculatores, the emperor's secret police, and brought back for exemplary punishment that often involved their entire family. The imperial archive expanded exponentially, growing with thousands of increasingly detailed and bureaucratic entries. Every act had its code, category, and subcategory. Forms had to be completed, protocols followed, chains of command obeyed. It was an accounting of horror, as meticulous as tax records or population censuses. At times, Caligula would read these entries aloud in the Senate, selecting passages at random, forcing fathers and husbands to listen to the intimate details of what had been done to their loved ones. Each recitation was a reminder that in this empire, nothing was sacred, no bond untouchable, and that the machinery of power operated above morality or mercy. Entry 346. Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius I, endured 4 long hours, 6 participants, a confirmed pregnancy, the public humiliation an inseparable part of her punishment. The collective memory of trauma was meant to be her legacy. Caligula wanted Rome to remember forever, each generation to understand what absolute power could enforce. The Praetorians, the emperor's elite guards, were integral to the system. They did more than protect. They participated actively. Caligula rewarded them with the very victims he had used first, another calculated layer of degradation. Roman noblewomen, violated first by the emperor, then by his guards, their suffering meticulously documented, archived for posterity, were part of a grim theater of control. Among the Praetorians was Cassio Chaerea, a seasoned veteran of the Germanic wars, constantly mocked by the emperor. Caligula ridiculed his soft voice, forced him to wear obscene passwords, paraded him naked before others. Chaerea had participated in the system like everyone else, yet something inside him began to fracture. It wasn't compassion for the victims, it was anger at his own humiliation. The night of January 24, 41 CE would be remembered as especially brutal. Caligula had organized a so-called divine fertility contest, forcing senators' wives to compete against gladiators. Numbers were shouted like bids at an auction, 20, 30, 40. Bodies moved mechanically, soulless. It would be the final ceremony. The following day, as Caligula strode through the palace's shadowed corridors toward the theater, Cassio Chaerea and several other Praetorians ambushed him. 30 stabs pierced his body, one deliberately targeting the genitals. Symbolic, yet bitterly ironic. The same men who had enforced the horrors were now delivering the ultimate judgment. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, was murdered an hour later. His young daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely 4, was crushed against a wall. The Praetorians sought to erase every trace of the dynasty, but they could not destroy the archives, the pregnancies, the scars, the memories. Emperor Claudius declared damnatio memoriae, statues smashed, coins melted, yet some things cannot be erased. Children born from the breeding program grew up unaware of their origins. Survivors aged carrying their silent, unbearable secrets. Parents who once held torches could never meet their daughter's eyes again. It was not merely a man who died, it was a system, and systems have ways of outliving their creators. Thunder echoed once more that final night. Marcus Claudius applauded the emperor's death with the very hands that once held the torch. His daughter Claudia, number 247, would never speak again. Caligula had not invented depravity. He had written the manual for institutionalizing it. And that manual, though burned, always finds a way to be rewritten, with no parents to protect them, no laws to shield them. The children of the empire learned that some evils transcend their perpetrators, burrow deep within institutions, and pass down like a generational disease.